Okay, Chair Bubenik, it looks like we have a quorum. If you're ready to convene the meeting, we can get started.
All right, let's do that.
Okay.
Let people turn their cameras on if they feel like doing that. Give me a second. I got Melinda is in there as a attendee.
Oh, okay. Oop. All right.
There she is.
Okay. Yeah, and we'll keep an eye as folks may pop on the call. We'll make sure to get the rest of the committee members promoted up.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. And now it's officially good afternoon. It's 12:01 to the May 20th, 2024 Washington County Coordinating Committee meeting. We'll start off today with public comment. We have 5 minutes set aside for public comment. There'll be comments from the public or from other folks, elected officials who'd like to talk about anything that's on the agenda tonight or today. I'm so used to tonight, or not on the agenda. So with that, is anyone registered to speak with the? I can't start. I've had a rough day today with public comments, Stephen.
We didn't have anyone who signed up in advance. If there are members, folks on the call that would like to have an opportunity to address the committee, they can raise their hand now. Promote it up. I'm not seeing any hands at this time.
All right, I'll move this to item number 2, introductions and roll call. I'm not seeing our 2 new mayors. Hopefully they're gonna hop in here soon. But Stephen, go ahead and call the roll, please.
All right, sir. All right, we'll go in alphabetical order as we usually do by jurisdiction. Mayor Jones for City of Banks.
Here.
Thank you. Mayor Beatty for City of Beaverton.
Here.
Thank you. Mayor Delane for Cornelius.
Learning how to use a phone here.
All right, thanks for joining. I think, as you mentioned, we're going to keep an eye out for Mayor Jinke from Durham, rather. I saw Mayor Wenzel from Forest Grove.
Yep,
Thank
here.
For Hillsborough, Mayor Callaway.
Here.
Thank you. I think we're also on the lookout for Mayor Thompson from King City. Mayor Linehan.
Here.
Thank you. Mayor Rosner.
I am here.
Thank you. Mayor Lube.
Here.
Thank you. Chair Bubenik. No, you're here. Mayor Fitzgerald.
Here.
Thank you. And Commissioner Pye.
Present.
Super. And for our ex officio or non-voting members, I see Councilor Rosenthal from Metro is with us. Thank you.
Yep. Present.
And I know Stephanie Turner is here with us from ODOT.
Yep, here.
Thank you. And John Sarah is joining us for TriMet today. Oh, and it looks like Mayor Thompson is on. Thank
Hi,
you.
I'm here.
Great. Thank you for joining us. We were just wrapping up roll call. All right, Mr. Chair, I think we're ready to proceed.
All right, terrific. Thank you. That brings us to item number 3, action item 3A, consideration of our meeting summary for April 15th, 2024. Hopefully everyone had a chance to review the meeting minutes. Does anybody have any changes they need made to the minutes?
I move that we approve the minutes.
Do I have a second?
Second.
I have a motion and a second for approval of the minutes of April 15th. Any discussions on those motions? All right, all those in favor signal your support by raising your hands or saying aye or both, please.
Aye.
All right.
Aye.
Those opposed? Abstentions? Looks unanimous. All right. That moves us on to item 4A, UGB capacity estimates and regional housing needs analysis. This discussion will be led by Ted Reid and Eryn Kehe. We've heard from them in the past, so I'm looking forward to an update. Welcome to you both.
Thank you very much, Mayor. My name is Eryn Kehe. I'm happy to be here with Ted Reid. We both work at Metro in the planning department. Should I share my screen for this presentation, or does someone have our presentation ready?
I have it ready.
Okay. Thank you, Teresa. All right, so the purpose of us being here today is because Metro and the region are going through our regular look at the urban growth boundary that happens every 6 years. We're in the middle of that process. We're actually kind of getting closer to the end. So this is a really great time for us to give you an update of the data and analysis that have been underway for the last many months, and help you understand the decision-making process that lies ahead, how decisions are made, how you can be involved, and what timing you need to think about for that process. So if we can go ahead to the next slide. Obviously, you know how important the growth boundary is to the history of our region. It is about being very deliberate in how we grow. It doesn't mean that we don't expand it. In fact, we look at opportunities to expand it pretty often, but it's thoughtful and deliberate to make sure that we're investing in our existing communities and using our land thoughtfully, so that we have both the urban and economic development and the housing we need, as well as protections of the farms and forests that surround us, which are really important to business and our way of life. So if you go to the next slide, I'll show you the schedule that we've been working through that really started in November of 2022. The navy blue on this schedule is all of our data and analysis, which is required by the state to inform a UGB process. And we also have you can see where we are here. See this arrow, you are here. It's in a light blue. So we're getting to the end of that analysis. The very end of that navy blue line is the publication of the Urban Growth Report. This is a decision-making tool. It is a place where a lot of information comes together. It is not a staff recommendation, but it is a lot of data and information to help decision makers inform their decision about whether the growth boundary should be expanded or not. And an important part of that that's also pulled out here is the green, and that is city proposals showing readiness and eagerness to develop into urban reserves. And we have received an interest from the city of Sherwood to expand into Sherwood West. So all of that, you can see how all of that comes together into this urban growth report that is really a kickoff of information to inform the decision-making process. And that decision-making process is shown in this schedule in orange. And it is the opportunity for MTAC, MPAC, Metro's CORE, which stands for Committee on Racial Equity, and of course the Metro Council to have their deliberations and debate on the data and information in the Urban Growth Report, and then to make a recommendation. The Metro Council is required to look at the urban growth boundary, as I said, every 6 years. So that timeline puts them at a need to make a decision in December of this year. So that's where we're heading. We're heading into that decision-making process with the intent for a wrap-up in December of 2024. And so the best opportunities for participation by jurisdictions all through the region is through MPAC and MTAC going in, and to talk with your Metro counselors and to be part of that conversation as the Urban Growth Report is released. We're looking at a June 30th release of the Urban Growth Report if you want to mark your calendars. Next slide. Here's kind of what I was just speaking to. MPAC makes a recommendation to Metro Council on the urban growth decision. They can look to MTAC for technical information and advice. There will be a staff recommendation, and that comes from Metro's Chief Operating Officer, that's shown in green. We anticipate that that will come out in early August. So there will be a period of time where we're just getting we'll have a public comment period when the draft urban growth report is released. We'll have 30 days of comment before our chief operating officer offers a recommendation to kind of fuel more conversation at MPAC and CORE and ultimately Metro Council. Just so you're aware, there's also been a group, the Land Use Technical Advisory Group, shown here on the bottom right, which is made up of staff from most of your jurisdictions. They've been meeting over the course of a year, getting a lot of detail into the technical analysis. Ted and I are going to go over kind of the high points of that technical analysis here, so you can understand what some of the dynamics that we're seeing. But that group has been digging into the methodology and double checking and checking work to see how to make recommendations based on local knowledge and understanding of information. So that's where we've been checking and double checking information. All right, let's keep going. Another list of all of those groups we've been all over the place. We've been giving a lot of presentations like this around the region. We've been working with the Home Building Association, for example. We've been going to MPAC and MTAC every month. Different and the kind of information that you're going to find in the Urban Growth Report, which Ted and I are going to touch on a little bit, are economic and development trends, information about the capacity of land inside the growth boundary to accommodate future growth, looking specifically at housing and employment needs inside the boundary and looking forward to the next 20 years, as well as looking at the proposal that we have from Sherwood about the concept plan that they've been working on for several years to expand their city to the west. Next slide. So the Urban Growth Report is a decision-making tool. It has all of the important information that I was just talking about all in one place. I mentioned June 28th, so there it is written again for you. Here are the major pieces of that, that report that inform the decision. It's about demand, so 20 years of growth. We have to look out 20 years and make sure there's enough land in the boundary to support growth. That's what's dictated by our state law. So we need to understand what that demand, what that growth is over the next 20 years. We need to understand the capacity in our growth boundary to accommodate that growth. So that's the capacity piece. And then readiness really is all about what cities have done the pre-work to understand what it'll take to grow into a new urban reserve, so that when an area comes into the growth boundary, it can start moving towards development quickly. Next slide. This is the basic state requirement that I talked about. We look at how much demand for growth is coming in the next 20 years. We subtract what capacity is inside the growth boundary, and it results in a need, or it doesn't. So if it results in anything that's a positive number, that's what our Metro Council needs to consider for expansion. And I think this is probably a good place to say, I've talked about this Urban Growth Report several times. The report won't have exact numbers for demand capacity. Instead, it'll have a range. So it will give the council and MPAC and others an area in which to talk about where an area backed by all the analysis and expert research. But that area is enough room to kind of debate what that demand and capacity and how that math equation works out. So we don't really know the answer to this math equation yet, but that's what is part of the decision-making process that you saw in that schedule in orange, is kind of a discussion about these ranges of demand and ranges of capacity that then results in an outcome that informs the decision. Next slide. Okay, so we're going to pause there and change to Ted. Ted Reid, welcome. Everyone, this is Ted, and he is project manager for the urban growth process. And he's going to talk a little bit more about what some of these preliminary results, what we're seeing and some of the trends to get you interested and excited, and take some of your questions at the end. Go ahead, Ted.
Okay, thank you, Eryn. Thank you, Chair and committee members. If we can move to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about the regional forecast first. When we talk about the regional forecast, just want to note this is for this larger 7-county metropolitan statistical area that's shown in the light blue on this map. So it includes counties that are north of the Columbia River in Washington State. This is a geography that's defined by the federal government. It's where some of our most reliable historic data come in at the 7-county level. This is our starting point. And eventually we get to a decision by the Metro Council about how much of that growth they're planning for in the urban growth boundary, which is shown here in red. But for the time being, I'm going to be talking about 7-county metropolitan statistical area for this forecast. If we can move to the next slide. The big headline here, and this is one that when we had our expert panel that reviewed our forecast, this is something they talked about a bit. We had folks from Portland State University's Population Research Center, economists from the state of Oregon looking at our forecast, and this is the big picture trend they came back to over and over, is that birth rates are declining. So people are choosing to have fewer babies than they did in the past. This is a trend that's happening in many countries around the world, definitely in the United States, definitely happening in Oregon, definitely happening in our region. So what this means, though, is that in about a decade, our region will get to the point where we won't see positive population growth coming from what we call natural change, which is the number of live births minus the number of deaths. We will see some population growth, we believe, coming from migration, and I'll get to that in a moment. But in terms of this natural change piece, this is a big change that again is based on this historic trend dating back to 1960. You see there's a peak in the natural change in say 2005 thereabouts, and it's been on the decline since. We do forecast a little bit of a bump up in the near term, but then longer term decline. Next slide, please. So this is getting to that migration aspect that I mentioned. This we do expect will be the source of population growth in our region. It's net migration, so it accounts for both people moving into as well as moving out of our metropolitan statistical area. This graph shows the trend, as bumpy as it is, going back to 1960. So you see a lot of up and down. The historic average over those many decades is about 15,000 net increase of people into the region per year. And that's our assumption going forward. And we think it's an optimistic assumption that will maintain that historic level of migration. Our forecast panel that I mentioned before, they talked about this a bit. They saw some potential downside here, particularly when it comes to affordability on the West Coast, relative affordability compared to other parts of the United States, and whether that may have a negative impact on migration going forward. But we're assuming in our baseline forecast about 15,000 additional people net per year. Next slide, please. And what this means when we take into account natural change, so again, that was births minus deaths, as well as net migration, we do see population growth in the metropolitan area, though at a slower rate than we've forecast in the past. It amounts to about 300,000 more people in the 7-county area over the next 20 years. And as Eryn described, we use a range forecast because there's uncertainty here, particularly around that migration aspect. Baseline forecast that you see in the middle there, the 2.9 million by the year 2045, that's the most likely forecast. So we've shown a high and a low, but they are not as likely to occur as this baseline forecast. Next slide, please. So population, of course, has impacts on employment. You have to have people to have workers. And we see that flowing into the employment forecast, which was also part of this expert panel review process. We see about 200,000 more jobs in the metropolitan area over the next 20 years. So again, baseline forecast is most likely to happen, but we've shown a range here because of uncertainty. This is definitely something we have all seen play out in the last several years, this uncertainty about global events and what they might do to the nation's and the region's economy. And that's true going forward. There's some uncertainty here, but again, baseline is most likely. Next slide, please. Okay, so that was the big picture demand side. Eryn, did you want us to pause here to take questions, or?
Well, maybe we ask the chair. We could pause here and take some questions here, or we could go ahead, go through the rest of the presentation and hold questions till the end.
I'd hold questions to the end.
Okay.
Thank you. So getting into the supply side. So again, Eryn mentioned supply and demand as essential components of what we're up to here. I mentioned demand side, that's where they're forecast. On the supply side, we look at how much room for housing and job growth is there inside the current urban growth boundary over the next 20 years. I'm going to talk about the residential side of this today. Next slide, please. So in terms of growth capacity, we categorize it in 3 different ways. The first category is vacant and partially vacant land. This is fairly self-explanatory. We start with aerial photos of the whole region inside the urban growth boundary, and we identify lands that are vacant or mostly vacant that undergoes local review by your staff. The second category is land for redevelopment infill. This is, which buildings, existing structures might redevelop over the next 20 years where there will be a net increase in the number of housing units that you can build on that property. This is truly a forecast. It's less of an inventory, and there's uncertainty around this. We have worked with Johnson Economics this go around to develop what we call a pro forma model that essentially looks at the financial feasibility of redevelopment, tax lot by tax lot inside the urban growth boundary, to come up with that estimate of regional capacity over the next 20 years. The third category is land inside the urban growth boundary that was added, say, since 2018 in that growth management decision that doesn't yet have urban level zoning. So think of Tiger River Terrace 2.0, areas like that that are still, what we have is essentially a concept plan for the area. So we've used those local estimates of capacity there. Before I leave this slide, I want to note there's some things we don't count here, and those are familiar to you all that have observed this process over the years. So the whole eastern portion of the former city of Damascus is an example of buildable land. So we've counted where we have not counted any future growth capacity because of the ongoing challenges with governance and infrastructure out there. Next slide, please. This is what it looks like. Again, we used a few different methods to estimate these 3 different sources of capacity. The pro forma model I mentioned, developed by Johnson Economics. So we get a range when we use these different assumptions going into these models. The models are very sensitive to those assumptions about things like interest rates and cost of construction. What we end up with is capacity inside the urban growth boundary for anywhere from 145,000 to 195,000 housing units. Again, broken out by these 3 different categories that I just mentioned. Next slide, please. Turn it back over to Eryn.
All right, let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to dive into how we move from a number of people. So we've talked about, I'm going back to demand. So when Ted showed you a range of the number of people we believe will be in the region in the next 20 years, part of our analysis needs to take that number of people and figure out what number of housing units are going to be needed to accommodate them, so that we can translate that need into to land capacity. We can put our numbers together. So to do that, we look at two different kinds of housing needs. We have to look at the future, the one I was just talking about, the people who are coming here over the next 20 years. But we also need to look at existing needs because we know that many of our neighbors are experiencing houselessness. So they are not currently housed. And so we need to get an understanding of how many people are in that situation and how much housing is needed to accommodate them, as well as historic underproduction. This is something you've probably heard about nationally, is the underproduction of housing that's been occurring over the last 15 or so years. We need to consider that historic underproduction, the housing needed for people experiencing homelessness, and have that exact existing number and then add our future number. And that will really give us a fuller picture of our complete need for housing. Next slide. So then we take the, when we're looking at the future need, all this idea here is to take, Ted was talking about the regional household forecast. So we need to know the number of people. And then we make some assumptions about what kind of housing types folks need at different stages in their life based on their income, on their age, how many people live in a household together, whether there are kids present or not. And we make some estimates of the type of housing characteristics, the different types of housing units that will be needed to accommodate that type of household, is whether it's a single family detached home or it'll be one of the many kinds of middle housing, which you might think of as a townhomes or cottage clusters, duplexes, or whether the need will be for multifamily. So we really try to dig into the different types of housing because obviously they take up different amounts of space. And this equation is all about how much space is needed to accommodate our existing and future needs. That's how we get to demand for land. Next slide. So there's also some really interesting facts that we've uncovered in the process of doing this that we want to share with you. In addition to a big trend in seeing the few people having fewer children than they have in the past, we're also seeing our baby boomer generation moving into their older years. And as a result, we're seeing great increases in people in their over 65 and adults with fewer children in their households. So you can see in this chart, both the impact of what Ted was talking about. In the orange, you see that in 20 years, we just have a lot fewer families with kids, families with a householder in the age between 25 and 44. That amount, that the number of people who are in that stage of life right now in the region we're going to have a lot less of them in that stage in 20 years. Meanwhile, those people will be 20 years older. And we're going to see all of the folks who are moving into that 65 and older age group really increase the number of people who are in that age group. So that's kind of an interesting dynamic to think about when we're thinking about what the future needs in terms of housing are for the region, because we know that people need different types of housing depending on their the size of their household and their age. So next slide shows another dynamic as we look at income level. So again, we're looking at the change between now and 20 years from now in 2044. And you can see that this chart really indicates much more people in those lower income ranges. So we're seeing the biggest change in 20,000 to 39,000 income ranges. And we think that has to do with what we've been talking about in general. We have an aging population who, if moving into retirement, aren't seeing the same kind of income. So that's in part about it, but also having more smaller households, not as many children in the households, more people living alone or living two-person households also just means more households, but less income per household. So these are kind of interesting dynamics. Go on to the next slide. That all kind of come into play in thinking about, well, what is it going to look like in the future? And this slide shows you the 3 different scenarios that our team put together to help think about where we think this level of need will be. And this is where the range becomes, this is where the range is built. So on one hand, we've called this scenario following on the footsteps. That's on the left. This scenario is going to assume that despite these changes that we know are happening in our demographics for the region in the next 20 years, generally people are going to make the same decisions about their housing that they have in the past. That folks who, let's say, are in my age range and are 50 years old today, they're going to be 70 years old in 20 years. And that I will make the same decisions that people who are in their 70s are making today. That's the idea of following in the footsteps. We expect things to happen the way they have in the past, and we can base our future expectations on what we've seen by looking back. Now, on the other side of this, on the right, is fundamental shifts. This is a scenario that says people who in our age group 20 years from now won't make the same decisions that folks in that position today are, either because they don't want to, or because their situation is different, or they have fewer choices available to them. Maybe it's their income, or a variety of other factors. But so if we think this more likely scenario is that there will be fundamental shifts in the type of housing that people choose based on their age range and their household dynamics, then we choose fundamental shifts. And in the middle is the new normal. That's a scenario where a lot of folks will still follow in footsteps, but will have some shifts, but they're not major shifts. So that's the place in the middle. So next slide. Essentially, we take this and put our numbers through it to estimate what we think housing needs will be in this low, baseline, and high. So the baseline becomes that new normal. The low is then based on fundamental shifts, and the high is based on following in footsteps, doing kind of the same thing that we have been doing historically. And so you can see this begins to form our range. And now we're looking at, instead of number of people, now we're looking at housing units needed in the next 20 years. And you can see there's quite a range here from the low side to the high side, going from 92,000 to 272,000. I also just want to point out, remember when I talked about existing needs and future needs? So you can see the existing needs are shown in gray at the bottom of each of these. And the green is what varies between them, because that's where we're estimating what choices people will make for their housing. Okay, next slide. This is where we'll stop and ask and take your questions. Thank you again for having us here. We really appreciate the chance to kind of give you a sneak preview of what you'll see in the Urban Growth Report, and just be available to dig into it with you and address your questions.
All right, if you could stop sharing, we can see each other. All right. Okay, we're all back. Questions for Ted or Eryn? I see Mayor Jones.
Hi, I was just curious if you're also looking at those of us from just outside of the metro boundary when you are counting your growth numbers for housing.
Thank you, Mayor. So a couple of things. The regional forecast that we start with is 7 county. It does include all of Washington County. So Banks is part of that 7 county forecast. And then we have what we call our urban growth boundary capture rate, where we estimate how much of that growth is likely to come to our urban growth boundary. The historic rate that we've documented is 70% of the new households in the 7 county area come to our urban growth boundary. So preliminarily, that's what Eryn was depicting in her slides on the housing needs analysis, that going forward, 70% of the 7 county household growth would come to our urban growth boundary.
Okay, thank you.
Mayor Wenzel.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the presentation. I'm curious, you talked about financial feasibility, and I'm wondering if Metro looks at financial feasibility for urban growth reserves. So in Forest Grove, our reserves are on the west side of town on David Hill, which would be really costly to develop. So I'm just curious how Metro looks at the reserves.
I'm gonna let Ted take that one too.
Okay, sure. Thank you, Mayor. So this is, thank you for the question and comment. This is part of the reason why we've really shifted our approach to growth management in the last couple of cycles towards being responsive to city proposals for expansions, because we have learned when we do the analysis first and don't pay attention to this question of city readiness, that often the lands can sit there when they're added to their growth boundary without development. And so the reality is that urbanizing these areas is costly. Sherwood has put together in their concept plan a description of how what those costs may be, and how they may pay for that infrastructure. So that's part of how we look at this. The other part is that state law has us compare all of the urban reserves among one another for how they might address a regional need for more capacity. Part of that analysis is looking at infrastructure costs of serving each of these urban reserve areas.
Mayor Callaway.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the presentation. So I guess I've got several questions. The first one, with the why of urban growth management, the fourth bullet says, reduce carbon emissions by keeping destinations close, and absolutely support that. My question is, what is the, and I don't mean this in a rhetorical sense, but keeping destinations close is such a subjective term. Okay. And when I look at the map, the regional forecast geography, which includes Skamania County and, Clark County and Columbia County, to me, that doesn't feel like destinations are staying close if that's part of the commute shed. And, so I guess that's more of a comment. I don't know if there's a question in there, but I just don't see how that is helping reduce greenhouse gases and carbon emissions. But that's why we need, additional capacity, I would say locally. Portland's losing population, and, a number of the cities are in the metro area. And, where they're going is, for instance, Woodburn, which is not included in the 7 counties. But I think, Woodburn, it was up over almost 7%, and it's because they have land. And that's the reason that they've given. And we've seen that time and time again. And so I just, again, with the Urban Growth Roundtable, I just am failing to see how not allowing for expansion will keep destinations close and will, meet the needs and accommodate the needs, for the growth. There's a comment that, as we age, and I'm probably the oldest, mayor in this group. And Joan and I are late 60s, and we will want to downsize, but all the new houses are duplexes and triplexes, multi-story houses. And that's what we'll want to get away from. And yet those aren't being offered. Now, cottage clusters, maybe there may be some opportunity there, but again, those are some of the highest expense per square foot, for construction. So, maybe that's something we could afford, but a lot of other seniors may not be able to. And so, again, I just worry that, some of this isn't, reflective of the reality. And I guess I had one question here with the regional demographic outlook. And I don't know if there's a way to put that slide back up. I think it's slide number 23, and I have that in my notes. But going back to 1990, where it's roughly 1,500, and that's in thousands, to where we are today, up at 2,500. And again, that's MSA population in thousands. Which of the three, the high or the baseline and the low, which of that trajectory from 1990 to 2023 is that closest to? Was that a high, graph line? Was that the baseline, or was that the low from what was projected back in 1990? Because that to me, and let's see, we're going back a little bit farther, but that to me would really help me know, the accuracy of, that trajectory, if that makes sense.
So to Claire, so let me make sure I understand the question.
Yeah.
What you're asking is if
So
when we
keep
made
going
these
back.
when we made these kind of
MSA
predictions
population in thousands.
in the 1990s, how accurate were we in making these growth projections then?
Not so much how accurate, but which model was closest to where we are today? Was that the low model, which, back in 1990, was it the low model that had us at 2,500 in 2023? Was it the high model, or was it the baseline model?
Well, Ted, what do you think? What rate?
I think the mayor is asking, so looking back at that historic period, essentially, if you assume
keep going
a straight
back.
line, if you assumed a straight line from that historic period, would we be looking at high growth today in our forecast? And I don't have the visual in front of me, but I guess I would say that well, you can have your own mental, you passed it there. You can have your own mental ruler of where we would end up if historic trends continued. I think more generally, though, what we heard very clearly from our demographer and economist panel was that things are different. Birth rates are down. We have an aging population, and so natural change is just not going to be the source of population growth going forward. So it's all going to come down to migration into the region, and there was uncertainty around that. They did not expect the kinds of high growth rates that we had in past decades.
If you go forward two more, that one. Is it this one?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, so I mean, maybe it's helpful just to see. I think for the most part, we've followed the baseline kind of follows the trend and slows down a little. But for the most part, our baseline averages have been pretty true to form most of the time in the past, if that's helpful to answer your question as well.
Yeah, so then for planning purposes, really the 3305 is not likely. The 2515 is not likely. We're looking more at the 2910. And I recognize things are different, but things are always different. I mean, they're always going to be different. But still, one of those three scenarios is going to be most accurate compared to the other two. So that
yeah,
was
essentially the way this works is that our economists and demographers, the folks who are professionals in this kind of projection, tell us that the baseline is the most likely to happen based on what's happened in the past. But this range is meant to inform the public debate. So that is what our council will ultimately decide, is where in this range do they think our regional demographic is going to be in 20 years. And so that's where MPAC and council get to have a conversation about, well, what are the trends that we're seeing today? What would need to happen for us to be on that high end, which essentially would be a lot of in-migration? Or do we think that declines in population that some of the cities in the metro area have experienced will continue, and that we're going to see a lot less in-migration and more out-migration? That might put you more on the lower end. But these are really anybody's guesses. Our professionals say that the baseline is the most accurate, but this is where we get to have a conversation together to find out where the council ultimately wants to land, and then what that means for the growth boundary decision.
Well, and in-migration is a key point, because with climate change, we're seeing climate refugees right now. And, so that is something I think that's going to have a big impact going forward. Thank you.
Mayor Fitzgerald.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor. I really appreciated this study, and one thing that Mayor Callaway just said reminded me of something that was shared when I worked as the fundraising head for the Nature Conservancy in Oregon. And the group internationally, Nature Conservancy, had been funded by the Doris Duke Charitable Trust to predict what climate change would bring in terms of predicted migration changes. And this was about 10 or so years ago, and they did predict that the Northwest would be a very appealing place for people to move. And that wildlife also has, and even plants have a better chance here than in some other places. So I do think that just continues to reinforce the fact that we, this will be a good place to move. I wanted to ask about the housing, the housing changes that we see on those graphs, the expected change in demand. One thing that I wonder if you could show there, and maybe it's not to show, but we're probably going to have to face the fact that as more people get older, we're going to be needing more mobility-ready homes. And some of those, that's a term I guess people are using to make that, to talk about various levels of ADA accessibility for homes. And that might be something that we all are going to need to look at in terms of a new form of infrastructure. Will it be more expensive to build? Will there be ways of building more one-story homes, maybe stacked one-floor condominiums, or even homes for sale that are not all extremely expensive, especially when we looked at that income change? So is Metro also looking at the economic effect of that income change, or is that a whole different study?
All of this, it really is another step. All of what we're doing right now is to make a decision about whether the urban growth boundary needs to expand. So it is pretty limited in its scope. I mean, it's a very important decision for the region. But no, it doesn't specifically get into, well, what do we need to do to encourage or incentivize or make these kind of products, these types of housing happen? Instead, right now, we're just using it as a measurement tool to know what kind of land would be necessary to make sure we have enough land available for these housing needs that we're going to have in the future. However, I'm really glad that seeing some of this data inspires your thinking as a policymaker about what additional conversations we need to have in order to make sure that when that future gets here, we're ready and we're providing for the needs of that aging population and for those changes in income level. But yeah, that is another conversation, because first we have to decide about land use and make sure the land's there. And then we need to talk about, well, what is it going to take to make sure people's needs are served?
Mayor Rosner.
Thank you, Eryn and Ted. I have to say I've seen this a lot now, so
Yeah.
you know some of my thoughts on this. But I guess for the group, it's a little bit of chicken and the egg, because we're, I think the aging community, the ADA requirements, and having housing that's compatible with that group is one of many issues I think we're going to be facing going forward. So we're making a decision about land with really not understanding, here's all the things we need to be doing to promote the modes of housing that we're going to need. So there's a little bit of a chicken and the egg, and just reminding people it's not only will inform the current cycle, we're admittedly Sherwood's the only one asking right now, but it'll also inform mid-cycle, and in 3 years, I'm assuming we'll do another one in 3 years. And there are off-cycle opportunities for employment land and stuff like that. So I think it's important we pay attention and talk as much as possible about what do we think, what are the modes of housing we need and how do we encourage it? It's kind of a wag the dog, type scenario here as we move forward, especially on the employment side. So anyways, just food for thought as we move forward.
All right. Any other questions or comments for go to the order here. All right. Well, thank you, Ted and Eryn. Oh, hand just went up. Councilor Rosenthal.
Yeah, I'll just ask one simple question. I mean, obviously the 7 counties is what we're evaluating, but as it was pointed out, I think by Mayor Callaway, Yamhill County is sort of a growth area, and we know that some of those people commute up this way. How do we estimate the impact, the fact that that's not part of our projections? And of course, the same thing is slightly true, I think, of Cowlitz County. I know a bunch of people who commute down into the area from, and in fact, I commuted from Kalama for a while. So people live up there because of the housing availability. How do we put that into our equation, or do we? I mean, does it have any impact?
Well, it does, because we're looking at our capture rate. So our analysis needs to look at a much broader area because, as many of you pointed out, our region doesn't operate in a vacuum. People are traveling inside and out of it. Our urban growth boundary isn't something you can see. It doesn't hold people in like a gate. So when we know that people's lives go beyond it. So that's why when we do the analysis, we're looking at a much broader area. So we're making sure that we're taking those dynamics into account. But when it comes to the decision before us is whether the urban growth boundary needs to expand or not to make capacity for the development that's needed inside the metro area to accommodate the activities that are happening in the metropolitan area. So when it comes to people coming into the area for employment, that has to be considered in our calculations about employment land needs. If the housing needs are specifically about people who we think are going to be choosing to live inside the urban growth boundary, and for that reason, we need to accommodate housing for them. But so it does all play a role, but it's how we're kind of anticipating what we think the future will look like, and how much it's going to be reflective of what we've seen in the past, or how much it will be just completely different.
So we do have a number for capture rate from, say, Yamhill County that is included in our assumption.
Well, it's the capture rate for the whole thing. We put it all together and look at what our region's capture rate is from the 7 county area.
Yeah, but Yamhill's not part of the 7 county area.
Oh, good point. Yeah, you're right. Oh, it's outside of
And it actually, it comes very close to, our boundary at some point, which is, so it's a little bit, it always shows up on the map as a white area right next to Wilsonville.
Yeah, good point. I mean, as we look at what our economic growth is, I think that's probably where we have some of that thought in terms of what the growth is in different industries that are inside the growth boundary. And that of course affects who has jobs that are available for folks traveling outside of the 7 counties. But maybe Ted wants to help me out since I clearly missed your original question. Ted, do you have anything to add?
At the risk of correcting the counselor, that Yamhill County is in our 7 county metropolitan statistical area. So that is how we account for it.
I think it's Marion County you were thinking
about. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
You're right. Marion County, not Yamhill.
Yes.
But I mean, Woodburn is in Marion County. And as Mayor Fitzgerald knows, there's a lot of people going back and forth on that freeway over the Boone Bridge every day.
You are correct on that, Counselor, that Marion County is outside of our 7 county metropolitan area. There is some commute shed there, clearly.
And so it's not accounted for in the data that we're looking at. I mean, we possibly could do it. We could assume a capture rate for a certain distance, but that's currently not part of the process, I gather.
You would presumably be interested in people living in our urban growth boundary and commuting to Marion County would be the sort of policy interest.
I think it would be both directions, depending on whether you're talking about employment or housing, correct?
Well, yes. And I guess in that instance, you would be wondering if Marion County needs to provide more employment land if they have residents that are commuting to our region.
Yeah.
Or I guess more broadly, if Marion County needs more employment opportunities, it's not necessarily all about land.
All right, we're falling a bit behind, so I'm going to go ahead and thank Eryn and Ted for joining us today. Thanks for the update. And I'm going to move us along to 4B, which is the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis Rulemaking Update. We have two guests from DLCD. We have Sean and Ethan joining us to give us an update on Oregon's new statewide Housing Needs Analysis Program. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And also, I should mention Ethan's not able to join us today, so
Okay.
it'll just be me today. Yeah, but yeah, thank you for inviting me. For the record, my name is Sean Edging. I'm a housing planner at the Department of Land Conservation and Development. I think I've seen a few of you before, but what I'm here to talk about today is to provide kind of a little bit of an update on a bill that was passed in the 2023 legislative session by the Oregon Legislature. That is the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis Policy, which includes House Bills 2001 and 2889. Really the intent of today's presentation, right? So the legislature passed the direction in 2023, kind of setting forth state policy, giving direction to agencies, all that type of stuff. And now we're kind of underway with a lot of the implementation. And so a lot of process is underway right now. We have different kind of policy conversations that are happening, a lot of methodological conversations that are happening. And really the intent of this presentation is to be both kind of like a little bit of a call to action, right? To say, hey, we have this process, here's going to be these timelines. We want to hear your feedback. We want to hear from the expertise of your staff, obviously your expertise as policymakers, that type of thing. But then also to provide just a little bit of context, right? What is this policy overall? What are going to be some of the important things to track or be aware of? Of course, how does this affect local planning and decision making, right? One of the things that I'll be kind of talking about in this presentation that you'll kind of see is really this bill is kind of a recognition that the way that we had planned for housing historically through our statewide land use planning goal 10, we've not been really achieving the outcomes that we wanted to see in terms of housing production, affordability, and choice. And so how do we reorient that system to really facilitate those outcomes, those goals that we have, where the state kind of takes a role in kind of this coordination, investment, partnership with local governments, and local governments take on that role with the kind of policies, actions, local decision-making, really that's necessary to kind of address all these different factors and address a lot of the things that you guys were talking about in this last piece, right? Things like accessibility or equitable housing outcomes or affirmatively furthering fair housing. I'll talk about that at a high level as we kind of go through this. So with that in mind, I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully I have the ability to do that. All right, are you all able to see what I'm sharing? Okay, great, awesome. Well then, yeah, I'll start going through it. I'm going to start by kind of going through maybe a little bit of a process piece, like who's doing what do we have that's going to be kind of on the outset, there's a methodology that's kind of being developed and what is it used for, that type of thing, and how do we get involved. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And then I'll shift to kind of talking through, as policymakers, you guys want to know, how does this impact our local communities? How does this affect how we plan for housing? And then I'll talk about that in kind of the second half of this presentation. And of course, for both of them, how, this process is underway. We haven't made any decisions yet. How do folks get involved if they want to, provide feedback, that type of thing? All right. So let's start with the kind of methodology itself. Let's start with the high level policy context and really start diving into, all right, so there's this kind of Oregon housing needs analysis. What does it consist of? What agencies are responsible for it? And how do we get involved? And I'll start by kind of outlining the responsibilities of different state agencies under this bill. So as mentioned previously, House Bills 2001 and 2889, it assigns different responsibilities to different state agencies around this kind of policy. And that it divides that responsibility among three different agencies, one being the Department of Administrative Services, specifically the Office of Economic Analysis. So these are the folks who do, say, like the regular revenue forecasting or employment, outlook, those types of documents or analyses. You also have Oregon Housing and Community Services, right, which is our statewide kind of affordable housing finance agency, right? They're the folks who fund affordable housing projects, including things like low-income housing tax credit projects, that type of thing. And then, of course, there's the Department of Land Conservation and Development, our agency, which is generally responsible for overseeing kind of the local implementation of Oregon's statewide land use planning program. And you can think about our different responsibilities in kind of three buckets. So what DAS is responsible for is kind of the math, they're directed to really conduct this Oregon housing needs analysis. They're directed to take the state, divide it into regions, develop an estimate for housing need, and then allocate that housing need to different local governments in those regions, considering a lot of those things that you guys were talking about, things like, where are the jobs, right? Where are we seeing population growth? How are they interacting with each other in terms of like regional commute sheds, that type of thing. I'll talk about that in a little bit. And then you could think about OHCS a little bit and kind of that tracking outcomes side of it. So one of the things that we kind of haven't really historically done is actually pay attention to how many units we build. And so the intent here is to really start tracking that, like how many units are we building, how many affordable units are we building, and then what progress are we making towards other dimensions of housing needs, say like equitable outcomes. Can say, for example, people access things like accessible housing, or are we addressing, say, patterns of racial and economic segregation? What are different outcomes for different demographic groups, right? All these kind of different dimensions that aren't really related to, the number of units that you're building, but really do play an impact on the overall housing picture. And then DLCD, the Department of Land Conservation and Development, we're all about that local implementation side of it, right? So we have this statewide land use planning program. One of those goals is Goal 10, which is really all about housing, and how we operationalize that and how we implement that at the local level is really, kind of the prime, role that our agency is going to play. What is the, how do local governments kind of take these numbers and these estimates and really operationalize them in terms of the local actions that they take? Right. And you'll notice, so one of the things I'm kind of talking about here, one of the reasons why we're meeting is this kind of methodology component is underway right now. So DAS is, starting the process. They're already starting to kind of consider some of these methodological components. And one of the things that's happening that's going to be very important is that they also have specific responsibilities in the metro region too, that are a little bit different than how they operate in the state. You notice I have this asterisk here, noting that the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis functions differently in the metro. And what does that mean? So you'll remember in the previous presentation, right? So we had our colleagues from Metro kind of give an overview of the regional growth management process, right? So they're kind of in this process to determine overall housing needs for the region. They kind of do that at the regional level, and they do that as part of their urban growth boundary amendment process. So one thing to kind of keep in mind in the context of the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis is DAS has a relationship with that process for the metro region, and specifically the metro urban growth boundary. So in most of the state, right, where we don't have the metro, what DAS's responsibility is kind of conducting this estimate of housing need for an entire region, taking that estimate and kind of divvying it out to different local governments, so cities and counties, based on kind of a standardized methodology, so an allocation. And then they use that estimate, so that's kind of every city's kind of need that they're going to be planning for, and a subset of that need is going to inform what's called a production target, which is essentially just a goal, right? Essentially in the near term, right? So we have this 20-year need, but in the near term, we know we need to build some housing units. Let's set an ambitious goal so that way we can start tracking and evaluating outcomes, right? As I mentioned previously, right? And one thing to keep in mind here is that we have I know that we have some folks here who are outside of the Metro UGB. For those folks, right, that is going to be a statewide allocation process, right? Metro is not going to be a determining factor in what your housing need that you plan for is. That's something that the Department of Administrative Services will be doing. But in the Metro UGB, Metro kind of takes that role of estimating the region's need, but then DAS has a role in allocating that need down to local governments, so cities and counties inside of the Metro UGB. That's very important. And then, of course, right, similar to kind of cities outside of the Metro region, that informs their 20-year housing need that they're going to be planning for, as well as their production target. And as part of this, the Department of Administrative Services has some kind of statutory responsibilities about what exactly they plan for. And that includes doing considerations of things like, obviously, population growth, which is a very important aspect of this. Also thinking about where the jobs are, right? And thinking about where are we planning for housing to be, obviously close to jobs, and, thinking about that regional commute shed aspect of it. And then, of course, thinking about an equitable distribution of housing in the region, right? It's not just enough to be planning for growth, but also you want to be thinking about, right, where are we building things like affordable housing? How are we addressing dynamics of things like racial and economic segregation, which affect our communities, right? And ensuring that we're planning for kind of equitable housing production everywhere in the state. And so that's something to keep in mind. One thing I'll kind of mention, I'm not here to talk about the nitty-gritty of the methodological details itself, kind of for two reasons. One is that I'm not a methodological expert, right? So I couldn't give it due justice, but also because we have two webinars where we have the kind of technical experts leading discussions about these. One of them is actually today. So on May 3rd, we had kind of a preliminary, right, statewide estimate methodology kind of webinar. The intent of this was to kind of say, all right, we've, DAS has done some thinking around the methodology. They've made some refinements to what was kind of this initially a pilot methodology. And we're going to start a process to refine this to a final version, but we got to, start somewhere. And so this methodology was intended to kind of give folks an overview and provide, a deep dive into all the different aspects of how we're estimating need in the state of Oregon. We have a recording that's up on OHCS's website. I'm happy to share links to all of these. And of course, I've shared the slides with staff too, who can share these out as well. And then later today, we have another webinar. And of course, everybody here is welcome to attend if you want to. There's a registration link, of course, also in the slides, as well as on OHCS's website, where we're going to be kind of diving into that metro-specific methodology, right? So kind of given that Metro has this special relationship where Metro kind of estimates the regional need, and then DAS allocates that to cities inside of the Metro, right? There's some kind of special considerations, right? And different sources of data that we can draw on to really operationalize the legislative direction. So they'll be kind of giving a deep dive into this. And again, this is an interim version. This is a draft version of the methodology that we're going to be talking about today. And of course, there'll be a recording also published to OHCS's website after that concludes. But then we have all this process that is to get us to this final version. So DAS, the Department of Administrative Services, they are required to finalize this by January 1st of 2025. That is when they have to publish the first set of numbers, and they're going to be doing that annually from here on out. But that's our kind of deadline. And to get to that point, we essentially have kind of a period of refinement over the next couple of months. So starting in June, OHCS is going to publish an interim version of the methodology. You can think about it like a first draft based on kind of refinements to the original pilot. That's going to be open for public comment during the month of kind of June and July. There'll be a 30-day public comment period. There'll be, of course, obviously notice that's published. And of course, everybody's going to be invited to provide your commentary. Definitely get your staff. We want to hear all the nerdy in the weed details and how we construct that methodology and, get it closer to the legislative intent. After that period, we'll go through kind of a refinement. All right, what did we hear? What are the kind of refinements that we need to make to the methodology so we can produce a draft version of the methodology that'll be available kind of around late August, early September, and it'll be available for public testimony. And this is where we'll bring it to the Land Conservation and Development Commission, that's our commission at DLCD, as well as the Housing Stability Council at OHCS. And they're going to, kind of have a period where we open it up for public comment. All right, what are the additional kind of feedback that we need to hear on how the methodology is constructed? And then after that point, DLCD and OHCS will kind of take those commentaries, all that testimonial, develop a set of kind of final recommended methodological considerations that we send off to DAS. And then DAS really is kind of the final decision maker. All right, what's going to be the regulatory methodology that's published on January 1st of 2025, right? So we have some process. We have a series of refinements that are happening. Of course, we want to hear from all of our local implementing partners on how we construct that. So definitely encourage getting involved, watching the recordings, diving in the weeds, and of course, providing your perspectives as policymakers. So that's one thing. So that's just a process that's ongoing. I want to now pivot and talk a little bit more about the policy implications, right? So I've talked a little bit about the methodology. I'm not going to talk about the methodological details, right? We have these webinars that are going and a process that's underway. But I do want to talk a little bit about the policy implications, which is, all right, so we have this methodology. It's going to estimate need. It's going to allocate need. What does that mean, right? How is this going to be used? How does this affect our local decision-making processes and the planning processes that we undergo in our city, right? And, I'll be kind of talking about that because the policy does change how we do this. Essentially, right, I mentioned at the big top of this that we have this statewide land use planning goal related to housing. That's goal 10. And what this policy is a recognition that the goal, right, what we've been striving for is good, but our implementation of it hasn't really gotten us towards the outcomes that we want to see, right? Housing production, affordability, and choice is often how I refer to that. And so what we need to do in order to kind of reinvigorate this process is we need to establish this kind of broader, more comprehensive system that pairs kind of state coordination, investment, partnership with local government kind of decision-making, implementation, local solutions, right, to kind of help us get towards these goals that we have in terms of housing production, affordability, and choice. And so let's start kind of at the top and let's talk about this goal 10 that's related to housing. This is a responsibility that, the state and local governments have had essentially for 50 years, starting with the kind of implementation or establishment of the statewide land use planning program, we've had this goal on the books, and it articulates. I have an excerpt in the text up here that kind of describes what this goal is all about. Essentially, what it says is that, local governments, in coordination and partnership with the state, have a responsibility to plan for a variety of options of housing choices for their community members, right? And this includes not just thinking about, the number of housing units that we're planning for, but also things like, what are the affordability levels? What choices, what are the characteristics of housing that we're planning for? How are we addressing, things like equity, right, in our housing plans, and providing meaningful choices for folks? And oftentimes we refer to this in shorthand as housing production, affordability, and choice. The idea that we're planning for options for our community members, right? And the way this kind of goal, or this high level goal, gets implemented is via what we call the Goal 10 planning process. And this diagram that you see right down here is intended to kind of illustrate at a very high level what, kind of the state and what local governments do to implement statewide land use planning Goal 10. Some of these, actually, some of you might actually already be familiar with in terms of local processes that you might have completed in the last couple of years, because this is an existing goal. This is an existing thing that local governments implement, as well as Metro implements. And these documents include a housing capacity analysis, right? So Metro just kind of showed you their version of the housing capacity analysis. Local governments also do this at the local level. Essentially, the idea here is you're looking at all of the land that exists within, kind of your city. And you are thinking about its capacity. How much housing would fit on this land, that is buildable, that we have within our communities? And, does that match up with need, right? So that's one document, really asking that land capacity question. And then the second document down here, this housing production strategy, some of you guys also might have completed this recently or might be underway with it right now. This document is intended to be an action plan. So over the next couple of years, right, we have thought about land, we've thought about our capacity, but housing doesn't get produced just if you have the land, right? There's all these different aspects that go into whether housing's produced. Are we servicing things with infrastructure? What does financing look like? What are the policies, actions, investments, tools that our cities trying to, put into place to promote the development of housing on the ground, and also to work towards more equitable outcomes too, right? Because it's not just about producing housing. We want to make sure that people have more options, especially people who've been historically marginalized, right? And so the thing to keep in mind about this whole system, right, that kind of happens at the local level, there's kind of some major changes that are coming as a part of this policy. And really they kind of happen mostly on the front end and on the end of the Goal 10 process. So on the left here, and this is where this kind of estimation comes back into play, I mentioned that there was this kind of statewide methodology or Metro-led methodology with, of course, a statewide allocation that is going to be happening, right, starting on January 1st of 2025. And the big change that's happening here is this is going to serve the basis of the housing that local governments are planning for. But there's also this kind of other element that you see right over here. It's going to be taken through this filter of local policy decision-making, right? So the state, right, or the state and Metro in this case, if you're in the Metro UGB, essentially will provide a number of housing units that cities plan for and affordability thresholds that cities plan for. But then cities really make a lot of local policy determinations about, what types of housing do we want to plan for in our community that can meet that need? What are the types of characteristics that we want to plan for? Obviously, housing size is one of them, but things like housing accessibility, whether our homes are age-friendly, that's another example. And then, of course, obviously, where do we want to facilitate this production, of course, right? And all of these are really local, kind of context-specific policy determinations that local governments will make. And then on the other end over here, the other aspect that is kind of new that this policy implements is this idea that we're actually going to start paying attention to whether we built housing, right? Which might sound maybe like a step one type thing that we should pay attention to, but hasn't actually been a part of the program. So the idea here is that we have these kind of regular reporting requirements and we have these housing production targets. And these are going to serve as benchmarks. They're ambitious goals. We know they're going to be hard to hit. We know it's going to take a lot of time to make progress towards these goals, but we should start tracking and seeing how we're making progress towards these different goals that we set. And if we're not meeting those goals, if we're falling behind, what are the actions that we can take to facilitate progress, right? And that second point is really important here. The idea behind this is not that we're trying to hit a specific number or that we're trying to hit specific affordability thresholds, but really that we're kind of thinking about the actions that we can take at the state and at the local levels to really facilitate outcomes, right? What do we have within our control to facilitate outcomes is kind of the underlying theme of this. And that kind of gets us to this next point, which is the Housing Acceleration Program, right? For thinking about outcomes, one of the things that I think a local policy maker would be, understandably curious about is, well, all right, we have these targets, right? We have these, we're going to be tracking and evaluating progress to outcomes. Well, what if we don't, what if we're falling behind on the, producing housing, or falling behind on things like subsidized affordable housing? What happens then? And that's really where we kind of get to this idea that the whole system that kind of exists in the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis is predicated on this idea that the state really should be stepping up with coordination, investment, partnership with local governments, and that local governments should really be thinking about the local policy solutions. And what we care about more is not whether we hit a specific number or not, but whether we're taking actions within our respective control to really facilitate progress, right? That's the goal, is to get us on the right track and to start taking actions to address need. And essentially what this process kind of sets out is, I mentioned previously, we have these targets. We have OHCS kind of tracking and evaluating outcomes. What this is a program where DLCD has this direction to say, all right, DLCD, go forth and periodically, take an evaluation, do a deeper dive, look into what barriers might exist for local governments that, might be falling behind on progress significantly in comparison to, say, their peers or in comparison to the region, and really think about, what's the context, right? What are the, potential state barriers or investments that we can make to really address barriers to production, as well as, of course, all the local dynamics that are happening that could be inhibiting production as well. And pretty much coming out of this, what are the actions that we can take to facilitate production is really the goal behind this process. It's not intended to be punitive. It's intended to be, right, kind of a partnership between state and local governments to address barriers. So with that in mind, I kind of mentioned, right, all of these kind of, local policy planning decisions. This is something that's ongoing. This is a process that's underway right now that our agency is undertaking. And we have a rulemaking process that's underway right now where we've been diving into these conversations. We have a rulemaking advisory committee consisting of a lot of different members, of course, including practitioners from Washington County, as well as around the state, to kind of dive into these questions with us. How do we operationalize this? How do we make sure that this is going to be effective and implementable at the local level? And of course, thinking about different kind of aspects of some of the technical nitty-gritty aspects of this, like how do we plan for need? How do we plan for production? How do we think about, the urban growth boundary and urbanization and planning for infrastructure to support housing production? And then, of course, on that piece that I mentioned on the Housing Acceleration Program, how do we make sure that that's a partnership between state and local governments and is effective in actually, achieving production affordability and choice? So this process is underway. Of course, we definitely we want to hear the perspective from local implementers, and it's something I just kind of want to mention, right? Because all of this is really going to come together and really kind of set the stage for how, state and local governments kind of plan for that long-term future of housing in the years to come. So with that, I'm going to take a step back. I'm going to, stop sharing screen here and start taking questions from y'all. And we can kind of dive into discussion.
All right. Thanks, Sean. Questions for Sean? Everybody pop back in here. Commissioner Five.
Thank you, Chair. I'll ask my question. I know I raised my hand last minute last time too, but I think this sort of ties. Sean, you blew my mind with your presentation. Thank you so much. There's a lot of good information you shared, and I think you did a really good job of making it succinct and digestible here, for at least for me. The question I have, and I think it's something that you brought up, it's also a question I had for the previous presenters is, this balance of urbanization with protecting resource lands. I haven't heard any complementary to housing or UGB expansion discussion that come up, like middle housing is a complementary to housing, dwelling, accessory dwelling units are complementary to resolving housing crisis, but I haven't heard that come up as something that to be considered before or while we answer the question of should we, how do we decide the UGB expansion decision? So, and then So I had that question for you. I don't know how to pose it, but I'm just gonna leave it open-ended like that. But the other thing that you mentioned is to be considered housing age-friendly. But hopefully the rulemaking committee is also considering income-friendly as well. So thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely. Excellent questions, Commissioner Fye. So to start with the first one, I think if I'm understanding it right, so the major change that's happening here, right? The way we've thought about housing kind of, over the past couple of decades has really just focused on this kind of narrow question. And, right, Metro mentioned that, like our Metro colleagues mentioned that they were only interested in one question, which is whether we have enough land in the UGB to accommodate future growth, right? And the idea here is that, yes, that's going to continue to be an important part of planning for housing, but it's not the only thing, right? You can have the land for housing and it can sit there, right? If you haven't put into place the policies, the investments, the actions, the strategies necessary to actually facilitate outcomes on the ground. And that includes obviously thinking about, not just housing diversity, like what other types of housing are we planning for, but how do we actually set up the conditions to make it conducive to achieving production and affordability and options for people, like the outcomes that we actually want to see on the ground. And so what this is really intended to be is to say, all right, we should set up goal 10 and we should structure the implementation around that idea that we should be taking actions to facilitate those outcomes, rather than just kind of this historically what was more of this narrow look at like whether we had enough land and kind of this math equation, right? That was really just about the UGB. And of course, that math equation is still going to exist there, right? The UGB is an important aspect of whether we can plan for enough growth, but it's not the only thing. If that makes sense. Does that help get at your question on that first piece? Okay, great. And then the second one, age-friendly and kind of accessibility. I think one of the things that it's a huge consideration. And it's actually one of the things too that like accessibility advocates will tell you that the thing that is most necessary, especially for people with disabilities or people as they age, which, right, I think a lot of people who have been doing good work on gerontology are starting to make it very clear, like we're talking about all of us, right? Because we're all going to hit this at some point in our lives. How are we planning for accessible, affordable options for people, right? And how are we encouraging that in the policies that we take, right, that encourage the production of housing? It's not just this kind of zero-sum game as to whether you're increasing costs or increasing accessibility. It's right, how do we actually achieve both of these outcomes that we want to see? And how do we incentivize that? How do we kind of work through these challenging policy considerations and interventions that we can consider at the local level to really facilitate that? So yes, absolutely, we're thinking about affordability.
Mayor Rosner.
Thank you, Sean, for the presentation. Great presentation. I appreciate all the detail. So my question is, I can't think of a mayor who isn't trying to figure out how to bring more housing into their communities, and there's been an implication, not from you, I want to be clear, but from some that the cities are the problem. And the reason I'm prefacing this question around this, because we've been talking for a long time about, for instance, infrastructure, sewer, water, streets, and all these things that are really a major impediment to getting more housing. We have a Brookman expansion area that was brought into the urban growth area, 10 plus years ago. But, we've been waiting on a sewer trunk line from Clean Water Services, for instance, among other things, before that can develop out. So as part of your analysis up front, as opposed to waiting for a city to come back and say, well, we're not meeting those goals, so let's do the analysis. Are you getting into the weeds about how land is constrained in different manners, whether it's infrastructure constrained, regulatory constrained? And I don't mean like, when I say that, I'm not referring to like wetlands type stuff. I'm talking about like proportionality rules and stuff like that cause certain plots to be very expensive to develop versus another plot. What are you guys looking at to really get in front of that equation? And before you answer that question, I just want another compliment. I really liked your words when you talk about partnership with local government. That is critical. People have heard me say it a million times. We need partnership, not mandates. And because we're here to help solve the problem. But anyways, I'm just curious about what kind of proactive data analysis, data gathering, and not to drone on too much longer. The League of Oregon Cities, as part of this last long session, did a really good job of at a high level, like collecting kind of infrastructure data and projects that would drive housing. But I think that really needs to be drilled down to what that means, ideally down to even a lot by lot level, but in each region. Anyways, I've talked enough. If you could give me your perspective on that, I'd appreciate it. Thanks.
Yeah, well, first, there's a lot there, so I won't be able to touch on all of it, but I think you're right that really the intent behind this is not to say that any one entity is responsible for fixing the housing crisis, but rather that it's this, we need all of these different levels of government, including the federal government, but we can't really affect what they do through this policy, right? But all of these different levels of government, and of course, housing producers themselves, we all have this kind of shared responsibility to take actions that are within our control to address barriers to production, right? That includes so many things that's beyond just whether or not we have land or whether or not we have, regulatory functions or that type of thing, and really get into these broader, more nuanced considerations about different areas where, sometimes there's state barriers or state funding gaps or, kind of all these different kind of components that really affect whether housing pencils on the ground, right? And that's just first and foremost, a fundamental kind of aspect of this is recognizing that shared relationship between both the state and local government in addressing the crisis. But then secondly, on the kind of infrastructure, the developability aspect of it, that's a major kind of consideration and component of this rulemaking process, which actually used to not be all that considered all that much, right? So, I mentioned that local governments plan to essentially have a 20-year supply of land within their urban growth boundary or in the metro region, kind of within their city or within adjacent kind of urbanizable areas. But it hadn't really historically considered, well, can you extend like trunks out to that lot, or is it readily annexable, and what developers would call shovel ready, right? Essentially, it makes sense to produce housing because the conditions are right in terms of like the infrastructure to actually support the provision of housing. So one of the major components of this is a recognition that, hey, if we're going to achieve these production targets, part of that consideration is about what lands that we have that are shovel ready. They're ready to go. We're thinking about the provision of infrastructure. We're thinking about development constraints, right? And we're thinking about things like not just like wetland regulations, but also the actual developability of land and how that intersects with our development code, that type of thing. So all of those are kind of part of this rulemaking process. And then one additional aspect that was added on in the 2024 session was this broader consideration around infrastructure, right? LOC did this kind of initial work to kind of start to identify some of those gaps that local governments face in having sufficient infrastructure to support production. And one of the additional pieces of direction that the legislature gave to us, and these are going to be conversations that are coming up in the coming months, so definitely stay apprised, right? And our regional reps will, of course, be sharing invitations to these conversations as they unfold. Direction to us to really kind of go to that next level to say, all right, the legislature has this role in funding infrastructure to help local governments produce housing. How do we do that? Right? How do we, we have limited resources. We have to make decisions on prioritizing investments. How do we do that in a responsible way that gets us closer to our goals? And so part of our considerations are going to be engaging with, local governments, housing developers, people around the state to talk about that, to talk about, all right, the legislature has heard loud and clear, we got to have these investments in infrastructure. Now the next question is really getting into how we do that in a way that gets us closer to our goals. So yes, absolutely. Again, I don't think that touches on everything, but these are definitely big parts of the consideration in the rulemaking process for sure.
Yeah, I think having really good data, granular data up front is critical because without that, we get into kind of these high level feel good conversations, at least from some quarters, like, oh, we just need to lower SDCs, or something like that. And it doesn't really look at the systems nature to all of this, right?
Agreed. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Sean.
Yeah, of course.
Just keep in mind, we're about 18 minutes behind. So,
Councilor
Rosenthal.
Thank you, Mayor. Sean, that's a very good presentation over an innovative and somewhat complex process. My question is going to be really having to do with, as you said, DAS is going to be doing the sub-regional allocation in the metro area. It's a question of bandwidth. What help is DAS going to need from, DAS is going to be responsible for the entire state, and we have 24 cities, and Metro has trouble keeping up with what everybody's needs are and responding to them. So I'm just a little worried of what help DAS is going to need from Metro to make this actually be effective, so that you don't talk to each city only once every 3 years or something like that.
Yeah. So So DAS has this responsibility in terms of running the actual numbers, right? In the same way that they have the same responsibilities for like the revenue forecast, right? Which inform things like the kicker, right? As we get to our budgeting process. And one of the things that they kind of need support on, or that's reflected in the policy, is this idea that the folks who should kind of support DAS in facilitating, coming to a final regulatory version of the methodology are the other agencies who specialize more in the kind of community engagement aspect. That includes OHCS, that includes our agency, DLCD, and of course, it includes to some degree some coordination with Metro. We've engaged in a couple of conversations with them so far around kind of some of the special considerations in the Metro. But then really this process that I mentioned, this is intended to be that place where we're like, all right, we need to set up this methodology and it's going to be running and updated with annual data essentially every year for the next little while. We need to get in, we need to have conversations, right? That's the intent. So, I mean, a lot of the support that we're providing DAS is really on that front, on the community engagement side of it. So that's, if that is a place where, cities really want to provide feedback on we think it's really important that the methodology reflect this. It's really important to get engaged in this process that's unfolding over the next year to be able to reflect that in the final version.
I can see that there's some room for discussion as to exactly how this interaction and these rules are going to work themselves out in practical terms. It's one thing to put it in regulations. It's another thing to work it out practically for the individual cities involved and share the appropriate kinds of data. As you know, Metro has additional sets of data that sometimes we coordinate with the state, and sometimes the coordination doesn't work as well as we wish.
Yep, and that'll always be a challenge, right? I think one of the recognitions is that we're always going to be working with data that's less than optimal. We're always going to be working in an environment where coordination is tough. You're also always going to be working in an environment where there's political dynamics too that make, forecasting difficult. We're not going to resolve those through these processes, but what is articulated in there is that DAS has this responsibility by January 1st of 2025. They have to run these numbers by that point. And once they do, those are the numbers, right? So this process that we have unfolding before us, this is really the important time to be getting involved and participating to reflect, what you guys are seeing on the ground.
Easy to say.
Sorry, Garrett. Thank you, Sean, for the information. It was very informative. So I just have I have a quick question, but I'm not sure if it'll be a quick answer. If there's this requirement for cities to have a 20-year supply of land for future growth, employment, housing, that sort of thing, why wouldn't there also be a requirement for cities below 10,000 in population to update their comprehensive plan to justify the numbers? I mean, if we're data driven and we need this data in order to move forward, why wouldn't cities below 10,000 also be required to do some sort of analysis to be able to provide those numbers to the state to justify the need?
Yeah, so technically there is. It's called periodic review. Essentially, it's a provision in statute that requires all cities of all sizes to update their comprehensive plan once every 10 years. But we also have an intersecting part of the Oregon Constitution, which is called the unfunded mandate provision of the Oregon Constitution, right? So we have this requirement to update on a regular basis. At some point, probably the recession, the legislature cut funding, right, to enable local governments to do that work, right? So it's kind of an unenforceable provision in statute. What was reintroduced with a bill that was, back in 2019, was this regular requirement that cities above 10,000, so cities that are larger, generally have more staff capacity, that type of thing, to regularly update their plans, and they provided funding specifically for housing. And so these cities that are below 10,000, they're not required to update their plans periodically on the same schedule that cities above 10,000 are, kind of recognizing that they have less staff capacity, right? They don't have as much capacity to be able to do all this work. But one of the things that's reflected in the policy, this is still state law, right? Like if a city updates their Goal 10 plans, they have to use these numbers. The thing is, they just don't have that regular requirement, except they can access all the same resources. So if a city is deciding that they want to be pro-housing, they want to pursue these policies, they want to support, enter partnership with the state, all of those resources and infrastructure is there for them to be able to do that. The main thing that's not there because of this kind of quirk in state law is this kind of regular requirement to update it on a regular schedule. Does that help clarify?
Yes, thank you, Sean.
Yeah, of course.
All right. Well, in the spirit that we're running out of time, we're going to have to end it here, Sean. Thanks very much for coming today. We look forward to hearing more from you in the future on how the state progresses on this planning process.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Okay, that brings us to item 4C, which is a proposed fiscal year 24-25 budget reductions to MSTIP program. And this is something that myself and Mayor Lanahan wanted to put on the agenda for general discussion by the Washington County Coordinating Committee. Last week, the County Budget Committee approved a transfer of $2.5 million from MSTIP to county general fund. As you all are aware, based on Stephen's outstanding presentation of the history of MSTIP and the history of Washington County Coordinating Committee, that MSTIP funds originated as a serial levy that was created in 1986, approved in 1989, and re-approved in 1995, and the levy is now permanent. The question is the county, was the intent of the levy to fund road programs or to provide additional funds for the county to use in the event of a shortage of general funds? The county adopted a policy number 404 in 2019 and revised it in 2021, which specifically addressed this question, the expenditure of MSTIP and WCCLS funds. It seems the policy will be set aside again for this fiscal year so that the transfer can occur. And in my mind, the question is, do you believe these funds are for county-wide use, to use on road funds, specifically the MSTIP question, or is this something the county has the ability to use for filling budget holes? I believe the intent of the program was to fund road projects and not to be used for county as a source of a piggy bank, if you will, for the county to fill budget shortages. So I just wanted to put it out to discussion, and I want to have Commissioner Fye speak first, given her perspective as a commissioner. And then I know Mayor Lanahan and Mayor Rosner would like to chat, and then we'll open it to the floor. So with that, Commissioner Fye.
Thank you, Chair and Mayor Bubenik. So the County Budget Committee voted, we had our last week, we had our final 3-day budget meeting, and we approved a balanced budget. And in that balanced proposed budget included the 2.5 million general fund transfer reduction to MSTIP. So, and I think you've all seen the PowerPoint presentations from the county, but that's the decision that the board and the budget committee has taken. There was a proposal to consider to sort of transfer 2.5 million of MSTIP money to augment this 2.5 million reduction of MSTIP, but that vote was overwhelmingly overturned of the budget committee, the county budget committee. So that amendment, and it wasn't just the MSTIP, just to be fair for this conversation, it was also WCCLS, who's also facing 1.6 million budget cuts as well. So those two were the amendments proposed, and they did not pass. But and I think everyone hopefully watched the budget comments that everyone gave. But the county budget committee voted to approve a 2.5 million transfer from MSTIP to the county general fund.
All right. One point of many of you have seen the budget memo for the fractionalization of the transfer of the money, and this is my opinion only. A lot of that is accounting sleight of hand. that where they say it was only a 0.5% reduction in MSTIP funding. When you look at it in the light of day, MSTIP is basically losing its increase in assessed value. The county is keeping that and just giving us I shouldn't say us, giving the program, the normal, if you will, the 3%, anything above that, the county is keeping as part of this transfer. So I just want to, if for those folks who didn't see the budget memo, take a look at it as this is being used as a justification to keep the money or use it for the transfer. With that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Mayor Lenihan.
Well, you mentioned something I wanted to mention, and knowing that keeping the intent of this program, it is a one-of-a-kind program, and it is a program that many of our cities rely on to help fund projects. And I just really kind of go back to the intent of the policy, or the intent of the fund. And how it needs to be honored, and we need to recognize that. Another thing that we've kind of talked about too is, it would be great to have a commitment to keep the fund as is, and not have any reduction, to use funds in other, there's funding at the county that can be used to help with the shortfall. I think I'm not comfortable robbing Peter to pay Paul, so to speak. And that's not how I do my budget, my personal budget or my city budget. So I just think it's something that we need to consider. And, if it does move forward to a point where it is cut, then I would strongly encourage the Board of Commissioners to make sure that this group is part of the conversation at least 6 months before they start talking budget again, because partnership is extremely important with the WCCC. Partnership is really important across the county, and this affects all of our cities and not just the county. So that's my 2 cents.
Mayor Rosner.
I agree with everything said so far, so I'll kind of give a different, maybe a slightly different perspective, but that aligns. I think this program was originally enacted by the voters. The voters agreed to set aside a little bit of their property taxes, or contribute additional property taxes, so we could fund transportation in Washington County. And we're the envy of a lot of other counties that we have this program, and it's one of the reasons we have such great roads here. I think, and the county enacted a policy to enshrine that, once it was rolled into the general fund, or the permanent rate, back, I think, Frank, was in the late 1990s, with Measure 5, I think, did that. I think if we're going to change that, there needs to be a robust conversation about that policy with the community and with the voters on whether they agree that policy should be changed. As far as I know, that policy still exists. It hasn't changed. So I have questions about how you can make that kind of budget decision without having that policy conversation and that policy changed and approved by the Board of Commissioners. But I think if this is the direction, then that robust conversation needs to occur with all of our communities. When I say communities, I'm not talking about this group. I'm talking about the people that live in our communities, and the citizens say, is this something we want? Do we agree with this? I think we owe it to our voters to do that. So I'll leave it at that for now.
But at this point, I'll open it to the floor. One of the things Tara and I chatted about, as she mentioned, is maybe drafting a letter with from the Washington County Coordinating Committee to the board, asking for that 6-month check-in, and also asking in the future that this is taken off the table, that this is not done again, and that they have a year to figure this out, how to fund the difference, because quickly, MSTIP is, one taking to hit the libraries, are taking them too. So I'm focusing here on the libraries because this is our coordinating committee, not the committee that runs the libraries. But with that, I'll open it up to Mayor Callaway, then Mayor Wenzel, then Mayor Beatty.
Thank you, and thank you, Chair, for the opportunity to discuss this. You know, just, I just kind of scrawled a few things out, and I just want to reiterate that this money's in the general fund because repeatedly, the Washington County taxpayers voted to support MSTIP, and the taxpayers never voted to move MSTIP into the general fund. That was just default with 5 and 50. So it is in the general fund, and while technically it's legal to move it around and use it for general fund purposes, I think it absolutely violates the spirit of MSTIP approvals, and this is where public trust begins to break down, and clearly this is where partnerships with cities become meaningless. And in the memo, it's stated that the approach was changed in early 2010 and in the mid 2020s. Well, that was last year, and I would argue that that's just a misrepresentation, because we were told repeatedly that it was a one-time event and not a forever change, not a policy change. And the result is that MSTIP is being rated again. My feeling is that SIP funds should be used, to support the county's general fund instead of MSTIP, and especially also instead of the library. I know the SIP amount was higher than expected. Now, I've also heard the argument that SIP is one-time money. Well, so is MSTIP. Okay, you cannot go back to MSTIP time after time and think it's always going to be there. I agree that people versus potholes, that people are more important. But I would also argue that there is a better long-term strategic investment in our people than using MSTIP. Those of us that were at JPAC last week heard the Multnomah County representative say that, or the representative from Multnomah County, not the elected, but the person that was attending. She said that 47% of Multnomah County's roads that are under their management are failing. Okay, 47%. And that maintenance has been deferred so long that the maintenance backlog is now their capital projects list instead of maintenance list. And that's my concern, is that that's going to be where we're headed. So I would also argue that beyond bad fiscal policy of rating MSTIP, it's also an equity issue. And I think Frank, Chair, you had a map that you forwarded,
Yeah.
and I'd like
Steven, can you share that map?
And the map shows the disadvantaged census tracts, for DOT. And when it's up, you'll notice that TV Highway from, Beaverton all the way over. And you'll notice that some of the disadvantaged census tracts are also down in South County as well. And these are all targeted areas for MSTIP improvements. And so we cannot claim as a county or as individual cities that we are prioritizing equity and safety for our low income and marginalized communities if we're taking the money that is supposed to support these areas. I think there's and I'll just leave it there because I think that map speaks volumes, and I think our actions need to be consistent with the priorities that we claim to have. So that's my 2 cents worth. Thank you.
Mayor Wenzel.
Thank you. I agree with all the comments already been said. I think that a couple of things I want to point out. I was just shocked. I'm not going to lie. Partnerships, cooperation are important. And I want to kind of swing back to what Mayor Callaway said about, people are more important than potholes. It's all interconnected. Our roads are what connect us to each other, to our jobs, to healthcare, to recreation. So you would say that that's an extension of our livability. So these things are important. And I just believe that, if it isn't broke, then there wasn't a problem to fix. Like, we still have needs in transportation every meeting I go to is that there's not enough funding, that we can't do maintenance, that we can't do this, that there's safety issues. People are dying because of some of our roads. And to say that we're going to take from this fund, which is important and has the track record and metrics to show success and to show partnerships within our region, to do something else is just shifting a problem. It's not solving a problem. And we're in this business to try to solve problems, not just to redirect problems. So I'm really disappointed in our Board of Commissioners. We're asked time and time again to trust each other. And I know that the individuals in this room and myself have shown up for the county. I've argued against my council to help support county initiatives like different funding and different things and said, hey, we can trust the county. And frankly, I don't right now. I don't feel like there is that reciprocity of trust and respect from the commissioners right now. So I'm disappointed. I completely support the letter for public comment on the budget and moving forward. And I want to thank Terry and Frank for getting this conversation started.
Mayor Beatty.
Yeah, I don't fundamentally disagree with what we're talking about today. I just, what is our approach going to be to have a solution? Because, all these cities, we have funds that come to us that we make decisions on as well. And so, is the path to try to fix where we are, or potentially like a ballot measure? Because I don't think that that the current commissioners can make an agreement for future commissioners that they're not going to do this again. I mean, I don't think that's real. I mean, we know we can't operate that way. This current board could agree to it, but what if we get a new chair? What if we get new members? What is that going to look like in the future? So is this the right way of solving it? I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there that I think we need to have a comprehensive look at this. What I'm the most concerned about right now, and I know we're talking about transportation, is the library, because the library is in my general fund, and my general fund is the one taking the largest hit right now. And we are offsetting a lot of county. When you look at the map for libraries, we offset a lot of county usage because of our UUA boundaries and where we're at. So I would say, it's fine for us to send a letter, but is this the right fix? And not that I agree with everything we're saying. I just want to make sure that our effort is moving in the right direction.
Point taken. Commissioner Fye.
Chair, I just want to make quick clarification. I wasn't raising my hand to add on, but I just wanted to make a clarifying statement that there wasn't a board commitment last year that the MSTIP cut wouldn't happen again this year. There was a one-time decision last year that was to reduce the general fund transfer to 1 year without changing the underlying policy. So not that there wouldn't be a future reduction. So I just wanted to make that clarification for the record, just as the board representative here.
Sure. All right, we're running out of time. So what I'd like to do is, obviously the board commissioners are going to pass this budget. They're running out of time. So like Mayor Beatty is saying, I'd like to, in a future meeting, discuss what we can do and how we can work with the commission. The commissioners, because there's got to be a better way, depending how you want to interpret the administrative policy 404. It shouldn't be done at all, but some people say, depends which lawyer reads it. But let's work in the spirit of cooperation, because that's the thing we're asking for. As Mayor Beatty said, we can't handcuff the future board members, but we certainly want assurance that MSTIP and the library will be the ultimate last thing touched, or work with the board when they're working on their CIP to make sure it doesn't get touched, that they have alternate funding mechanisms. So we've only got a few minutes left, but thank you, Mayor Beatty, for your point. I know we don't like to be hamstrung as city councilors and future city councilors. We don't want to do that to them, but it's as was mentioned, we got to figure this out together. And the board, in my mind, never reached out to us. I never got a call or anything from any of the commissioners, other than one, and we know who he is. And he was one of the dissenting votes about this. We only have 6 minutes here. I wanted to get on the agenda. We're cutting Stephanie way short. So let's get to item 4D. We have a presentation from Stephanie on ODOT Summer Construction Update. I appreciate you being so patient. We can't hear you, Stephanie. Nope. Now you're muted.
How about now?
Now we can hear you.
Ah, beauty. Okay, we don't have to go through the whole presentation. I know we're super short on time. I want to highlight one large closure that's coming up, and I can give this presentation next month, or people can just review the presentation and send comments and questions back to me. So I just want to draw your attention. It's not for another month and a half, but the last weekend of June, so Friday night, June 28th, to Monday morning at 5 a.m. July 1st, I-5 in Southwest Portland is going to be closed. So it's going to be a huge regional impact, and it's the weekend before 4th of July when a lot of people are traveling and preparing to get out of town. So just wanted to get the word out that I-5 in Southwest Portland is going to be closed that weekend. Please send questions and comments to me. I'm happy to connect you to the right people if I don't have the answers. And Teresa and Jessica, I'm happy to present next month on the whole summer projects that ODOT, has in Washington County. Or again, if everyone just wants to review that, it's in the notes and agenda, and you can send questions over.
All right.
Thanks.
Quick, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, that brings us to the JPAC agenda review. Mayor Callaway and Commissioner Fye.
To save time, I'll either Commissioner Fye can do it, or you can just look, there at the work plan. It's included.
All right. MPAC agenda. Mayor Rosner.
Thanks, Frank. I'll keep it very quick because I know we're short on time, but everyone just saw the urban growth report presentation we just got. MPAC's going to have a role in advising Metro Council on that here shortly and on what the ask is going to look like. So feel free to reach out to me if you have concerns or questions or thoughts on how we support maybe an amended recommendation to the Metro Council.
Okay. So I'm going to quickly circle back to the MSTIP discussion with the last 3 minutes we have. So Terry and I will work on drafting a letter with Stephen about the future and our desire to work with the board. Like I said, they gotta, as much as I don't like it, they have to fund their budget this year. So let's look forward, and we'll bring this back next month for the letter review, so that we can get it registered, get it on the record that we want to work with the board and be part of the discussion next year versus just hearing about it via a memo. Does that sound good to folks? With that, we have 2 minutes left. Anything else for the good of the order?
Chair Bubenik, I was just going to let you know, I saw that late, unfortunately, Commissioner Willie had raised his hand, I think, back at the end of the MSTIP discussion. So I know we don't normally take comment after the public comment, but I defer to the chair.
Right. We don't take comment after public comment. Because Commissioner Fye is the representative for the board. All right. Okay. With that, thank everyone for this meeting with a lot of good stuff, and have a good afternoon. Hopefully the sun will stay for a little while. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.